Abby Harris, a determined teenager struggling after her mother's mysterious disappearance, stumbles upon a journal that uncovers a web of corruption tied to Silverline Industries, a company with a polished reputation and a sinister agenda. As Abby digs deeper, she faces relentless intimidation, betrayals from trusted allies, and a system rigged to protect the powerful at any cost. With the help of a tech-savvy roommate, a whistleblower risking it all, and a relentless journalist, Abby takes on a fight far bigger than she imagined. Protests erupt, secrets come to light, and lives hang in the balance. But as Silverline retaliates with everything they have, Abby is forced to confront her deepest fears. How far will she go to stand up for justice, and will the cost be too great? The journey is harrowing, the stakes are high, and every act of courage ripple into a moment of change. The city never truly slept. Beneath the neon glow of billboards advertising luxury apartments and bustling restaurants, shadows stretched long and cold. Abby Marshall walked silently among them, her sneakers worn thin against the cracked pavement. The chill of the night seeped through her tattered hoodie as she clutched her old, overstuffed backpack to her chest. Inside it were all the pieces of her life, pieces she refused to let go of, even as her world crumbled. The backpack held a photo of her and her mother, taken 2 years ago when the future still felt like something bright. There was also her mother's journal, pages filled with notes Abby did not yet understand. They were her only connection to the woman who had disappeared one rainy morning and never returned. Abby had learned not to hope too much. Hope felt like a cruel joke when you lived in alleys and scrounged for food in dumpsters. She slept where she could, in bus stations, under stairwells, or in the shadows of the city's crumbling east side. Tonight, it was the empty shell of an old laundromat. The machines had long been ripped out, leaving cold tiled floors and walls that carried the sound of passing footsteps too well. Abby tucked herself into a corner, the thin blanket she carried offering little against the freezing night. Hunger gnawed at her, but her exhaustion was deeper. As she lay there, the ache of loneliness crept in. It was always worst at night, when the world felt impossibly large and she was nothing more than a forgotten speck in its endless maze. Abby tried to imagine her mother's voice, soft and reassuring, but even that memory was slipping away. Abby awoke to the sound of soft footsteps. She froze, holding her breath as shadows danced across the walls. A figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the streetlights. The stranger hesitated, then crouched to leave something on the ground before walking away. Curiosity battled fear as Abby waited until the figure was gone. Slowly, she crept forward and found a small bag. Inside was a neatly wrapped sandwich and a bottle of water. Her stomach clenched at the sight. It had been days since she'd eaten anything more than scraps. But as she sat in the dark, clutching the food, another emotion stirred confusion. Why would someone leave this for her? She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from strangers. The sandwich tasted better than anything she could remember. As she ate, she tried to piece together who the figure might have been. Was it pity or guilt? It didn't matter. That single act of kindness became a tiny ember of warmth in the cold emptiness of her nights. The next morning, Abby decided to venture back toward the housing project where she and her mother had lived before everything fell apart. The neighborhood had changed since then. The small shops and community gardens were gone, replaced by boarded-up windows and construction fences. As she walked, the weight of her mother's journal in her bag felt heavier. Abby had skimmed it once or twice, but the notes were cryptic names, dates, and strange symbols. Her mother had always been a fighter, advocating for tenants when landlords raised rents or cut off utilities. Abby wondered if her disappearance had something to do with that. Near the edge of the housing project, she spotted 2 men standing near a rusted gate. Their voices were low, but Abby caught fragments of their conversation. "We've got to clean up the loose ends," one of them said. "Demolition starts in 3 months, and the boss doesn't want any surprises." Abby's heart raced as she ducked behind a dumpster. Loose ends? Demolition? Her mind swirled with questions. She watched as the men climbed into a black SUV and drove off. Once they were gone, she crept closer to the gate. Inside, the building looked abandoned, but something about the scene felt wrong. A torn eviction notice flapped against the fence, the bold words "Final Warning" barely legible. Abby felt a chill unrelated to the weather. She didn't understand everything, but she knew this place held answers. That evening, she returned to the laundromat, her thoughts restless. The memory of the food left behind lingered in her mind. She wondered if the stranger would come again. As the night deepened, her question was answered. The soft crunch of footsteps approached. Abby peeked around a corner to see a man in a police uniform kneeling near the doorway. He placed another small bag on the ground and began to leave. "Wait," she called out, surprising even herself. The man turned, startled. He was older, with kind eyes and a face that looked like it had seen its share of hard days. "I don't want trouble," Abby said quickly, her voice guarded. "I'm not here to cause any," he replied, keeping his distance. "Just thought you might need a little help." Abby studied him, unsure whether to believe him. "Why?" The man hesitated, then shrugged. "Because someone once helped me when I needed it. Name's Colin Harper. I'm a night shift officer, but I'm not here to make you do anything. Just thought you might appreciate not being hungry." Abby didn't respond, but she didn't run either. Colin took that as a good sign. "You don't have to trust me," he said. "But if you ever need someone, I'll be around." With that, he left, disappearing into the night. Abby stared at the bag he left behind, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what to make of him. Cops weren't people she trusted, but his kindness felt real, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel completely invisible. Later that night, Abby opened her mother's journal again. This time, she read it more carefully, searching for clues. One page caught her attention, a list of addresses, some crossed out, others circled. "What were you looking for, Mom?" Abby whispered into the darkness. The final entry in the journal sent a shiver down her spine. "They want to scare us into silence. But I won't stop. Not until everyone knows what they've done." The words felt like a challenge, a spark of her mother's courage reaching across time. Abby didn't know where this path would lead, but she was tired of running. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and stared out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was the truth, and for the first time in months, Abby felt like she might be brave enough to find it. The morning light crept through the broken windows of the laundromat, illuminating the streaks of grime on the tile floor. Abby shifted beneath her blanket, the rough fabric scratching her skin. She hadn't slept well. The words in her mother's journal replayed in her mind, alongside the memory of Officer Colin Harper's kind eyes and soft voice. She wasn't sure if she believed him. Adults often said one thing and meant another. Still, his gesture lingered like the faint warmth of a fire long extinguished. Abby packed her few belongings and stepped into the street. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. The addresses in her mother's journal pulled at her curiosity. She needed answers that might explain why her mother had vanished. The first address was across town, a long walk through the city's maze of alleys and side streets. Abby kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Her life had taught her to stay invisible. When she reached the building, it was clear it hadn't been lived in for a long time. The windows were boarded up and graffiti covered the brick walls. Abby's heart sank. She pushed through the rusted gate and walked around the property, searching for anything that might connect it to her mother's notes. In the backyard, she found a crumpled eviction notice pinned to a door. The dates matched entries in the journal. "They took everything," Abby whispered, running her fingers over the faded paper. As she stepped back, her foot caught on something, and she stumbled. Looking down, she saw a charred notebook half buried in the dirt. The pages were blackened, but a few words were legible. "Tenant demands investigation. Funds missing. Evictions unlawful." Abby's pulse quickened. Her mother wasn't just fighting for their home, she was uncovering something much larger. That evening, Abby returned to the laundromat, her mind racing. The journal and notebook painted a picture of someone brave and determined, someone who refused to be silenced. Could she be that brave? She didn't have long to ponder. The sound of footsteps echoed outside, steady and deliberate. "Abby tinst, klipping her bedsheitli." "Abby," a familiar voice called. Relief washed over her as Officer Harper's face appeared in the doorway. He was holding another bag, the same as before. "I thought I might find you here," he said, setting the bag down. "I brought something extra this time." Abby stayed quiet, watching as he stepped back. When she finally reached for the bag, her hand brushed against something unfamiliar, a flashlight. "It gets dark out there," Harper said gently. "Figured you might need it." "Why do you care?" Abby blurted out, the question escaping before she could stop it. Harper's face softened, his eyes reflecting something she couldn't quite place. "Because no one deserves to be forgotten. And because I see someone who's stronger than she realizes." Abby didn't know how to respond. She wasn't used to kindness, and she didn't trust it. But something about Harper felt genuine, even safe. "Thanks," she mumbled, slipping the flashlight into her bag. The next day, armed with the flashlight, Abby ventured to the second address in the journal. This one was an old community center, now boarded up like the first. Inside, the air was stale, and the floor creaked beneath her feet. Abby's flashlight illuminated scattered papers, broken furniture, and graffiti-covered walls. At first, it seemed like another dead end. But then she saw at a corner of the wall where the paint had peeled away, revealing a hidden message scrawled in marker. "They don't want us to know." Abby's heart raced. She wasn't imagining things. Her mother had been right, something was being hidden, and it was worth risking everything to uncover it. As night fell, Abby sat in her usual corner of the laundromat, flipping through the journal. She tried to piece together the clues, but the puzzle was far from complete. Her mind wandered back to Harper. She wondered what drove him to help someone like her. Did he see her as a charity case? Or did he really care? Abby shook her head, trying to push the thoughts away. She couldn't afford to rely on anyone. 2 days later, as she searched for the next address, Abby found herself walking past a small diner. The smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee made her stomach ache with longing. She lingered near the window, watching the bustle inside. A waitress in her mid-20s noticed her and stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. "Hey there, kid," she said. "You hungry?" Abby hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Come on," the waitress said with a smile. "It's slow today, and I hate seeing someone go hungry." Before Abby could argue, she was ushered inside. The warmth of the diner wrapped around her like a blanket, and the waitress, whose name tag read Lucy, set a plate of pancakes in front of her. "Eat up," Lucy said, sitting across from her. No strings attached. Abby took a cautious bite, her body relaxing as the food filled her empty stomach. She hadn't felt this safe in months. "So," Lucy said, leaning on her elbows, "what's your story?" Abby didn't answer at first, but something about Lucy's kind eyes and easy demeanor made her want to talk. "My mom, she's gone," Abby admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She was trying to stop some bad people. I think they did something to her." Lucy's expression shifted, a mix of concern and determination. "Bad people, huh? I've seen my share of those." "You have proof?" Abby hesitated before pulling the journal from her bag. Lucy flipped through it, her brow furrowing as she read. "These names," Lucy said. "I've seen some of them before. Tenants mostly. People who got evicted around the same time." "You know them?" Abby asked, her heart racing. Lucy nodded. "I'm a social worker. A lot of the families I work with lived in the same housing projects." Abby's grip on the journal tightened. "Can you help me figure out what this means?" Lucy studied Abby for a moment before nodding. "I can try. But if what your mom was digging into is as big as it seems, we'll need to be careful." That night, Abby returned to the laundromat with a spark of hope. For the first time in months, she wasn't alone. Harper's quiet support and Lucy's willingness to help felt like lifelines, pulling her back from the edge. As she lay under her blanket, staring at the journal, Abby felt something she hadn't in a long time: determination. Her mother's fight wasn't over. And now, neither was Abby's. The city woke slowly, with the hum of traffic and the chatter of early commuters blending into a muffled symphony. Abby sat on the edge of a cracked curb outside the diner where Lucy worked. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a steaming cup of cocoa Lucy had handed her before starting her shift. "You're welcome to wait inside," Lucy had offered with a soft smile. Abby had hesitated. Inside meant walls, and walls felt confining. She wasn't ready for that yet. She sipped the cocoa, watching the city move around her. For so long, she had felt like a ghost, drifting unnoticed. Now it was different. The journal in her bag wasn't just a reminder of her mother, it was a map, pointing her toward answers. Lucy's words from the night before echoed in her mind. "We'll need to be careful." Abby glanced at the list of addresses scribbled in her notebook, copied from her mother's journal. There were still places to check, but she couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Later that morning, Abby found herself sitting across from Lucy in the diner during a lull between the breakfast and lunch rush. Lucy had brought her laptop, its cracked screen a testament to years of hard use. "This might take a while," Lucy warned as she began typing. "What are you looking for?" Abby asked. "Patterns," Lucy replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "If your mom was investigating something big, she would have left breadcrumbs. Names, dates, maybe even financial records." Abby watched in silence, her chest tightening as Lucy's focus deepened. It was strange to have someone care this much. "I found something," Lucy said after several minutes. She turned the screen toward Abby, showing a spreadsheet filled with eviction notices, city permits, and property transfers. "This," Lucy explained, pointing to a row of addresses, "is your old housing project. And these," she scrolled further down, "these are the names of families who were evicted over the past 2 years." Abby leaned closer. The names matched some of the ones she had seen in her mother's journal. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It means someone wanted these families out," Lucy replied grimly. "And fast. See these transfer dates? Properties were sold to a private developer, Silverline Industries, just days after the evictions." Abby's hands clenched into fists. "They kicked us out so they could sell the buildings?" Lucy nodded. "That's what it looks like. But there's more. These zoning permits, they're for demolition, not renovation. Silverline isn't rebuilding. They're clearing the land for something new." Abby's mind raced. She remembered the 2 men near the gate, their talk of loose ends. Her mother hadn't just been fighting for their home, she had stumbled into something much larger. That evening, Abby headed to the next address on her list, with Lucy's cautious encouragement ringing in her ears. "Stick to the edges. Don't get caught." This address led her to an abandoned playground, its swings creaking in the wind and the merry-go-round rusted into stillness. The air was thick with neglect, but Abby's eyes were sharp, scanning for anything that might stand out. Near the back of the lot, she found a cluster of graffiti-covered walls. Most of it was meaningless scrawls, but one symbol stopped her in her tracks, a jagged arrow pointing downward. Beneath it, the words "Don't look away" were spray-painted in bold red letters. Abby crouched, her flashlight revealing a loose patch of dirt at the base of the wall. She dug with her hands, her heart pounding. After several minutes, she uncovered a plastic bag, its contents wrapped in layers of duct tape. Inside, she found a USB drive. Her mind raced. Why would someone leave this here? Had her mother hidden it? Or someone else? Abby's fingers trembled as she held the drive. Back at the diner, Lucy plugged the USB into her laptop. Abby sat beside her, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. "It's encrypted," Lucy muttered. "Give me a second." She worked quickly, bypassing layers of security until the screen filled with files, dozens of spreadsheets, emails, and scanned documents. "These are contracts," Lucy said, scrolling through them, "between Silverline Industries and city officials. Look at this." She clicked on a file labeled Project Horizon. The document detailed plans for a massive commercial development, with Silverline purchasing properties across the city for pennies on the dollar. "Your mom wasn't just fighting for tenants' rights," Lucy whispered. "She was exposing corruption at the highest levels. Politicians, developers, they're all in on it." Abby's stomach churned. She thought of the eviction notices, the boarded-up homes, and the families who had disappeared without a trace. "They knew," she said, her voice barely audible. "They knew what they were doing, and they didn't care." Lucy copied the files on her laptop, keeping the original USB intact. "This is enough to blow their whole operation wide open," she said. "But we have to be smart about this." "What do you mean?" Abby asked. "These people are powerful," Lucy replied. "They've already gotten rid of your mom, and they won't hesitate to come after anyone else who threatens them. The weight of Lucy's words settled heavily on Abby. Her mother's disappearance wasn't an accident, it was a warning. As they left the diner that night, Abby noticed a black SUV parked across the street. She froze, her instincts screaming at her to run. "Lucy," she whispered, tugging at her sleeve. Lucy followed Abby's gaze, her face darkening. "Keep walking," she said calmly, placing a protective hand on Abby's shoulder. They turned the corner, moving quickly into the maze of alleys behind the diner. Abby's pulse raced as they ducked into the shadows. "Do you think they know?" Abby asked, her voice shaking. "They're watching," Lucy replied. "But that's all the more reason to keep going." That night, Abby returned to the laundromat, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and determination. She couldn't shake the image of the SUV or the files they had uncovered. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "They don't want us to know." Abby clutched the journal tightly, her resolve hardening. If her mother had been braving enough to stand up to them, then she could too. She pulled out the flashlight Harper had given her and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness of the laundromat. For the first time in months, the shadows didn't feel so overwhelming. Abby's nights had become restless. She would wake in the darkness, her chest tight, images of black SUVs chasing her through endless alleys flashing through her mind. The files from the USB haunted her thoughts. They weren't just numbers or contracts, they were proof of lives destroyed for profit, a stark confirmation of everything her mother had fought against. She clutched her backpack as she walked through the quiet, early morning streets. The laundromat no longer felt safe, and she had started moving between abandoned buildings each night, never staying in one place for too long. Her mother's journal felt heavier with each passing day, as though the truth it contained was a weight she wasn't sure she could carry. Lucy had promised to meet her at the diner after her shift, and Abby arrived early, sitting at a booth in the back corner. She nursed a cup of water, her mind racing. Every creak of the door made her flinch, expecting someone to step in and drag her away. "Sorry I'm late," Lucy said, sliding into the booth across from her. She placed a manila folder on the table, her expression grim. "What's that?" Abby asked, her voice low. "Everything I could find on Silverline Industries," Lucy replied. "They've been buying up properties all over the city, low-income housing, old community centers, even schools. They've got friends in City Hall and the zoning board, and they're using their influence to push out anyone who gets in their way." Abby stared at the folder. "So, what do we do?" Lucy hesitated, glancing around the diner before leaning in closer. "We need to expose them, but we have to be smart. If we go public without solid evidence, they'll bury us and anyone who helps us." Abby's stomach churned. "What if they already know what we have?" Lucy frowned. "That's why we have to move fast. If we can get these files to someone who'll listen, maybe a journalist or an advocacy group, they might be able to blow this wide open." As they left the diner, Abby noticed the same black SUV idling near the curb. Her chest tightened, and she grabbed Lucy's arm. "They're watching us," Abby whispered, her voice trembling. Lucy's eyes darted to the vehicle, her expression hardening. "Keep walking. Don't look back." They turned a corner, weaving through side streets until they reached the safety of a crowded bus stop. Abby's heart pounded as they blended into the crowd, the SUV nowhere in sight. "They're trying to scare us," Lucy said, her tone firm. "But we can't let them win." Later that evening, Abby decided to visit one of the addresses in her mother's journal. She knew it was risky, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she needed were hidden in the places her mother had investigated. The building was an old apartment complex, its windows boarded up and its doors padlocked. Abby crept around the side, finding an open window that led to the basement. She climbed through, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was damp and cluttered with old furniture and piles of forgotten belongings. Abby's flashlight illuminated a stack of boxes near the back wall, their labels faded with age. She opened one, finding a collection of photographs, letters, and eviction notices. As she sifted through the papers, one photo caught her attention. It was a group of tenants standing in front of the building, holding signs that read "Stop the Evictions" and "Silverline Out." Her mother was among them, her expression fierce and determined. Tears pricked Abby's eyes as she traced her mother's face with her finger. "You really were fighting for all of us," she whispered. She tucked the photo in her bag and continued searching the boxes. Near the bottom of one pile, she found a folder marked confidential. Inside were documents outlining Silverline's plans to redevelop the property into luxury condominiums. "They never cared about the people here," Abby muttered, her voice filled with anger. The sound of footsteps above her made her freeze. Someone was in the building. Abby turned off her flashlight and held her breath, listening as the footsteps grew louder. "Check the basement," a gruff voice said. Abby's heart raced as she scrambled to find a hiding spot. She ducked behind a stack of old mattresses, clutching her backpack tightly. A beam of light swept across the basement as two men entered, their voices low. "Boss wants everything cleaned up," one of them said. "No loose ends." Abby's blood ran cold. They were here to destroy the evidence. She waited until the men moved deeper into the basement before slipping out from her hiding spot. She crept toward the window she had entered through, her movements as quiet as she could manage. Just as she reached the window, her foot snagged on a loose board, sending a loud clatter echoing through the basement. "There's someone here," one of the men shouted. Abby scrambled through the window, ignoring the splinters that tore at her hands. She hit the ground running, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the men chased her through the alley. Her heart pounded as she rounded a corner, darting into a narrow passage between two buildings. The passage was dark and cramped, but Abby didn't stop, her desperation driving her forward. She emerged onto a busy street, the sound of traffic and chatter enveloping her like a shield. She ducked into a convenience store, crouching behind a shelf of canned goods as she caught her breath. The men didn't follow her inside. After several tense minutes, she peeked outside and saw the street was clear. That night, Abby returned to the laundromat, her body sore and her mind racing. She spread the documents she had found on the floor, piecing together the puzzle of her mother's fight. The photo of her mother stood out among the papers, a reminder of the courage it took to stand against something so much bigger than yourself. Abby clenched her fists, her fear giving way to determination. "You didn't give up, Mom," she whispered. "And neither will I." The next morning, Abby met Lucy at the diner, her bag stuffed with the documents and photos she had collected. She told Lucy about the men in the basement and the evidence they had tried to destroy. "This is huge," Lucy said, her voice filled with urgency. "If we can connect this to the files on the USB, it could be enough to expose them. But what if they find us first?" Abby asked, her voice trembling. Lucy placed a reassuring hand on Abby's shoulder. "We'll find a way to keep you safe. I promise." As Abby walked back to the laundromat that evening, she felt a flicker of hope amid the fear. The pieces of her mother's story were coming together, and with Lucy's help, she was closer than ever to finding the truth. But the black SUV parked near the corner reminded her that the fight was far from over. Abby's hands trembled as she tucked the documents and photographs deeper into her backpack. Every step back to the laundromat felt heavier, the echo of her own hurried footsteps bouncing off the alley walls. She glanced over her shoulder again and again, certain the black SUV was somewhere nearby, its shadow creeping just out of sight. The laundromat felt more oppressive than usual that night. The whir of passing traffic seemed distant, muffled under the weight of her thoughts. Abby spread the evidence across the floor again, this time carefully arranging it by date, her flashlight's beam steady. Her mother's face stared back at her from the group photo, defiant and brave. Abby traced her finger over the worn edges of the photograph. "I'll finish what you started," she whispered. The thought should have emboldened her, but it only deepened her unease. Her mother had fought and vanished. Abby was alone except for Lucy and, maybe, Officer Harper. Harper, the memory of his kind words, and the flashlight he'd given her softened some of the night's edges. Abby didn't trust easily, but something about Harper made her feel safe, even if she wasn't ready to admit it. The next morning, Abby returned to the diner. Lucy was already seated in their usual booth, her laptop open and a cup of coffee steaming beside her. "I ran more searches last night," Lucy said as Abby slid into the seat across from her. "Silverline Industries is bigger than we thought. They're tied to a dozen shell companies fake businesses use to hide their tracks. It's no wonder no one's caught them yet. Abby pulled the photograph from her bag and set it on the table. I found this in the basement of one of their properties. My mom's in it. They were protesting the evictions before she disappeared. Lucy studied the photo, her expression grim. Your mom was fearless, she said. She must have known how dangerous this was. Abby nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. What do we do now? Lucy hesitated, her fingers tapping against the edge of her laptop. We need someone who can take this public. Someone with the reach and resources to make sure it can't be buried. I think I know a journalist who might help, but it's a long shot. Why a long shot? Abby asked. Because going after people like this isn't easy, Lucy said. They'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves. Abby thought of the men in the basement, their voices cold and calculating. The memory sent a shiver down her spine, but she forced herself to push the fear aside. Lucy arranged a meeting with her contact, a journalist named Mark Bennett who had exposed corruption in City Hall years ago. He agreed to meet them in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. The cafe smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee. Abby and Lucy sat near the back, their nerves stretched tight. Mark arrived a few minutes later, a tall man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. He shook Lucy's hand before sitting down, his gaze flicking to Abby with quiet curiosity. So, Mark said, leaning forward, Lucy tells me you've got something big. Abby glanced at Lucy before pulling the USB from her bag. She placed it on the table, her hands trembling slightly. Mark took the drive, inserting it into his laptop. His expression shifted as he scrolled through the files, his brow furrowing with each passing second. This is damning, he said after a long pause. You're saying this connects directly to Silverline Industries? Yes, Lucy replied. And Abby found additional documents that tie their property acquisitions to illegal evictions. Mark nodded, his expression serious. If this holds up, it could be one of the biggest stories of the decade. But we'll need to verify everything. People like this don't go down easily. Abby watched him closely, trying to gauge whether he could be trusted. What happens if they find out we gave this to you? They'll try to discredit us, Mark said plainly. But I've been through this before. If we can get this published widely enough, they won't be able to bury it. Abby's stomach churned. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this fight, but there was no turning back now. That night, Abby returned to the laundromat, her thoughts tangled. The cafe meeting had given her a flicker of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by fear. If Mark Bennett was right, Silverline wouldn't go down without a fight, and Abby had already seen what they were capable of. Her unease grew as she noticed a piece of paper tucked under the laundromat's door. She unfolded it cautiously, her pulse quickening. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Abby's breath caught. She shoved the note into her bag, her hands trembling. They knew where she was. The next day, Abby decided to visit Officer Harper. She wasn't sure what she would say, but the weight of the note was too much to carry alone. The police station was a stark building with a steady stream of officers coming and going. Abby lingered outside, unsure if she should go in. Harper spotted her before she could decide, stepping out of the station and approaching with a warm smile. Abby, he said, his tone gentle. What brings you here? She hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Can we talk somewhere private? Harper's expression shifted to concern. Of course. Follow me. He led her to a small park a few blocks away, where the noise of the city faded into the rustle of trees. What's going on? Harper asked, sitting on a bench and gesturing for Abby to join him. She pulled the note from her bag and handed it to him. I found this last night, she said. They know what I'm doing. Harper read the note, his jaw tightening. This isn't just a scare tactic, he said. It's a warning. Whoever left this wants you to stop because you're getting too close. Abby looked away, her chest tightening. I don't know if I can do this, she admitted. What if I end up like my mom? Harper placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You're braver than you realize, Abby, and you're not alone in this. Lucy, Mark, and I were all here to help you. Abby swallowed hard, Harper's words softening the fear that had taken root inside her. Whatever you decide, Harper continued, just know you're not invisible. You matter. And so, does what you're fighting for. Abby returned to the laundromat that evening with a renewed sense of determination. She spread out the documents and photos again, her mind racing with plans. She didn't know what the next steps would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Abby woke with a start, her pulse racing. The events of the previous day played on a loop in her mind: Mark Bennett's determination, Lucy's support, Harper's promise, and the chilling note that now felt heavier than its paper and ink. The laundromat's dim light filtered through cracks in the boarded windows. Abby sat up, clutching the flashlight Harper had given her, a small comfort in a world that seemed to grow darker by the day. She didn't feel safe here anymore, but there weren't many other options. She packed her belongings quickly, her hands lingering over her mother's journal before tucking it carefully into her bag. Each page felt like a fragile piece of her mother's voice, urging her forward. Lucy called later that morning. Mark verified some of the files, she said, her voice taut with urgency. We're close, Abby. He's already drafting the first article, but we need one more thing to seal this. What's that? Abby asked, the phone trembling slightly in her hand. Witnesses, Lucy replied. Mark thinks if we can find people who lived in those buildings or worked for Silverline, it'll make the story impossible to ignore. Abby's stomach churned. Witnesses meant putting real people in danger, people who might already be scared or have too much to lose. Do you think anyone will talk to us? Lucy hesitated. It's a long shot, but if they know the truth is finally coming out, they might feel brave enough to share their stories. They started that afternoon, knocking on doors in neighborhoods near Silverline's properties. Most people didn't answer, their windows curtained and their porches empty. The ones who did often looked wary, their eyes darting around as if the very act of talking was a risk. Abby found herself growing more disheartened with each rejection. I don't want any trouble, one man said, his voice low. I've got kids to think about. Please, just leave us alone, a woman whispered before closing the door. It wasn't until they reached the edge of a rundown block that someone finally opened up. An older woman with tired eyes and a threadbare sweater stood in the doorway, looking them over carefully. What do you want? Lucy explained their purpose, showing the woman one of the documents Abby had found. The woman's face hardened as she scanned the page. You're poking a hornet's nest, she said. We know, Abby replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. But we can't stop now. The woman sighed, leaning against the doorframe. I live in one of their buildings. Same story as everyone else. Promises of repairs that never came. Then the eviction notice showed up. No warning, no explanation. Did you ever see anything suspicious? Lucy asked gently. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. You mean besides the men in suits poking around at all hours? Or the trucks hauling stuff out in the middle of the night? Yeah, I saw things. But what good does it do me to talk? They got money. Power. I've got nothing. Abby stepped forward, her heart pounding. If we don't speak up, they'll keep doing this to more families. They'll win. The woman studied Abby for a long moment before nodding. Phoenix, I'll talk, but not here. Meet me at the church on Maple Street tonight. It's safer there. The church was quiet when they arrived, its stained glass windows casting muted colors across the pews. The older woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Carter, sat near the front, clutching a worn notebook in her hands. I kept this, she said, holding the notebook out to Abby. It's nothing fancy, just notes I made about what I saw before they kicked us out. Thought it might come in handy someday. Abby flipped through the pages, her breath catching at the detailed accounts, names, dates, descriptions of men in suits, and strange deliveries. It was a treasure trove of first-hand evidence. Why did you keep it? Abby asked. Mrs. Carter's expression softened. Because I hoped someone like you would come along. Someone who wouldn't let them get away with it. That night, Abby returned to the laundromat with renewed determination. She spread Mrs. Carter's notebook across the floor, cross-referencing it with the files from the USB. Patterns began to emerge, timelines aligning, names matching, details painting an undeniable picture of corruption and greed. She felt a flicker of hope. They were so close. But as the hours stretched on, the reality of their situation crept back in. Abby knew Silverline wasn't going to let this go unanswered. The note they'd left for her was proof of that. Her flashlight flickered, and she realized she'd been staring at the same page for minutes, lost in thought. "You're stronger than you think," Harper's voice echoed in her memory. Abby clung to those words as she packed her things and prepared to meet Lucy the next morning. The next day, Mark Bennett called Lucy with an update. The first article was ready, detailing Silverline's connections to illegal evictions and their plans for redevelopment. It named politicians, outlined the zoning permits, and highlighted the human toll of their actions. "I'm publishing it tomorrow," Mark said, "but we're going to need more than one story to keep the pressure on. If you find anything else, get it to me." The three of them, Abby, Lucy, and Mark, decided to meet that evening at the diner to finalize their plans. As Abby walked to the meeting, she noticed the black SUV parked at the corner again. This time, she felt a rush of defiance instead of fear. They couldn't scare her anymore. The diner was quieter than usual, the hum of conversation muted. Lucy was already seated at their booth, her laptop open and a stack of papers spread across the table. "I've got Mrs. Carter's notes," Abby said, sliding into the seat. Lucy scanned the pages, her expression growing more serious with each one. "This is incredible," she said. "It's exactly what we need to follow up on Mark's article." They were deep in conversation when Mark arrived, his face pale and his movements hurried. "We've got a problem," he said, sliding into the booth. "One of my sources just called me. Silverline knows the story's coming, and they're not happy." "What does that mean?" Abby asked, her voice tight. "It means we're on borrowed time," Mark said. "They're going to come after all of us the second this goes live." Lucy looked at Abby, concern etched across her face. "We need to get you somewhere safe." Abby shook her head. "No, I'm not hiding. My mom didn't back down, and I won't either." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but if we're doing this, we need to move fast. No more waiting." As the three of them left the diner, the tension was palpable. Abby couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to move, and every sound made her jump. But even as fear clawed at the edges of her mind, Abby held onto the flicker of hope that had carried her this far. The truth was coming out, and this time, Silverline couldn't stop it. The air outside the diner felt heavier than usual, as though the weight of what they were about to do pressed down on every breath Abby took. She clutched her backpack tightly as she, Lucy, and Mark walked briskly to the bus stop. The sound of their footsteps echoed in her ears, amplified by the uneasy silence between them. Mark's words rang in her mind. They know the story's coming. For weeks, she had fought to uncover the truth about Silverline Industries. Now, that truth was ready to burst into the open, but the stakes had never been higher. Every shadow felt like a threat, every passerby a potential enemy. Back at the laundromat, Abby spread her findings across the floor one last time, her hands trembling slightly. Mrs. Carter's notebook lay open next to the USB drive and her mother's journal, each piece a part of the puzzle. Lucy sat cross-legged nearby, typing furiously on her laptop. She was preparing a digital backup of the files to send to Mark in case anything went wrong. "Are you sure about this?" Lucy asked, glancing up. "Once this story goes live, there's no undoing it." Abby nodded, though her voice wavered. "We have to do it. They've hurt too many people. Someone has to stop them." Lucy offered a small, encouraging smile. "Then let's make sure we get it right." The following morning, Abby and Lucy met Mark at a coffee shop downtown. The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Mark had his laptop open on the table, the article ready to publish with a single click. "This is it," he said, his voice steady but grim. "Once this goes live, they'll come after us harder than ever. But it'll also put a spotlight on everything they've done." Abby glanced at Lucy, then back at Mark. "Do it," she said firmly. Mark hesitated for a moment, then pressed the button. The screen flashed as the article went live, and within minutes, notifications began flooding in. News outlets picked up the story, and social media buzzed with outrage. Mark's article had named names, detailed evidence, and provided first-hand accounts from tenants like Mrs. Carter. It was a devastating expose, the kind that couldn't be ignored. The reaction was immediate. Within hours, calls and emails poured in from reporters, activists, and even a few politicians. Mark's phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, while Lucy monitored the growing attention online. Abby felt a strange mix of relief and fear. The truth was out, but what would happen next? As they left the coffee shop, Abby noticed a familiar black SUV parked across the street. Her stomach twisted as the window rolled down, revealing the cold gaze of a man in a dark suit. "They're watching us," Abby whispered to Lucy, gripping her arm. Lucy glanced at the SUV, her expression hardening. "Let them watch. We're not hiding anymore." That night, Abby returned to the laundromat, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. The adrenaline that had fueled her all day was fading, leaving her drained. She sat on the floor, flipping through her mother's journal, searching for some kind of comfort. Her eyes landed on a familiar passage. "Even when it feels like the world is against you, remember that you're not alone. Every act of courage, no matter how small, creates ripples that can change everything." Abby clutched the journal to her chest, tears welling in her eyes. She missed her mother more than ever, but those words gave her strength. The next morning, chaos erupted. Mark's story had reached national headlines, and the backlash against Silverline Industries was swift. Protests sprang up across the city as people demanded accountability. Tenants who had been silenced for years began sharing their stories, and advocacy groups rallied to their cause. But Silverline wasn't going down without a fight. By midday, Abby's phone buzzed with a frantic call from Lucy. "Abby, are you somewhere safe?" Lucy asked, her voice tight with urgency. "I'm at the laundromat," Abby replied. "Why? What's wrong?" "Silverline's pushing back hard," Lucy said. "They're claiming the story is fake and that we're fabricating evidence." "And? Mark just called me. He thinks they're trying to track us down." Abby's blood ran cold. "What do?" "We stick together," Lucy said firmly. "I'm coming to get you. Stay put until I get there." As Abby waited, the unease in her chest grew heavier. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting someone to burst in at any moment. When Lucy arrived, she was breathless and carrying a small duffel bag. "We can't stay here," Lucy said. "It's not safe anymore." "Where will we go?" Abby asked, her voice trembling. "I know a place," Lucy replied. "It's out of the way. We'll lay low until we figure out our next move." They left the laundromat under the cover of darkness, sticking to side streets and alleys to avoid being seen. Abby's heart pounded with every step, her senses on high alert. The safe house Lucy brought her to was a small, run-down apartment on the edge of the city. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a momentary sense of security. Abby collapsed onto the worn couch, her body aching with exhaustion. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Lucy, her voice quiet. "Why are you helping me?" Lucy sat beside her, her expression softening. "Because someone helped me once," she said. "When I thought I was completely alone, someone showed me kindness. And it changed everything." Abby nodded, the weight of Lucy's words sinking in. "Thank you," Abby whispered. Lucy smiled faintly. "We're not done yet, but we'll get through this. Together." The next day brought more bad news. Mark called to inform them that Silverline had filed a lawsuit against him and the publication, claiming defamation. It was a calculated move designed to intimidate and distract. "They're trying to stall," Mark said, "but it won't work. The truth is out, and people are listening. We've got momentum now." Abby clung to his words like a lifeline. Momentum. Maybe it was enough. That night, Abby sat by the window, staring out at the city. For so long, she had felt invisible, powerless. But now, she realized she wasn't alone. Her mother's journal, Lucy's unwavering support, Mark's determination, they were all proof that even in the darkest moments, there was still hope. And hope, Abby decided, was worth fighting for. The dim apartment felt like a fragile cocoon, shielding Abby and Lucy from the chaos outside. But even here, Abby couldn't shake the unease crawling beneath her skin. Silverline's retaliation had come faster and harder than any of them expected, and the weight of what they were up against grew heavier with every passing hour. The news was relentless. Mark's story dominated headlines, but so did Silverline's counterclaims. Their lawyers flooded the media with denials, calling the allegations baseless and accusing Mark, Abby, and Lucy of fabricating evidence. Talking heads debated the story's authenticity, while Abby's face, a photo Lucy had taken from a protest, flashed across screens with captions questioning her credibility. Abby sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest as she watched the coverage. "What if people believe them?" she asked, her voice small. Lucy sat beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Some will," she admitted. "But we've got something they don't, the truth. And the truth has a way of cutting through the noise." That night, Lucy's phone buzzed with a message from Mark. "New lead," she said, reading aloud. "A former employee from Silverline wants to talk. He says he has proof to back up the files." Abby sat up, her heart racing. "Is it safe?" Lucy hesitated. "Probably not, but we don't have much choice." The next morning, they met Mark in an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. Abby's nerves buzzed as they waited, the shadows around them feeling more alive with every passing moment. Their contact arrived shortly after. He was a wiry man in his late 40s, with a nervous energy that made him glance over his shoulder every few seconds. "My name's Eric," he said, his voice low. "I worked for Silverline for 15 years. I handle the permits for their properties." Mark nodded. "And why are you coming forward now?" Eric shifted uncomfortably. "Because I couldn't live with it anymore. I thought I was just doing my job, but the things I saw," he trailed off, rubbing a hand over his face. "People being pushed out of their homes. Fake reports about safety hazards. Money changing hands to keep inspectors quiet. It's all in here." He handed Mark a battered laptop. "Every email. Every document I saved. It's all there." Lucy leaned in, her expression sharp. "If you've had this, why didn't you go public sooner?" Eric hesitated, guilt flickering in his eyes. "Because I was scared. Silverline doesn't just ruin people, they make them disappear. But when I saw the article, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. You've already put your necks on the line. The least I can do is help." They left the warehouse cautiously, Eric parting ways with them after giving Mark his contact information. The laptop was a goldmine, filled with detailed records that confirmed everything Abby's mother had uncovered and more. "This could be the nail in their coffin," Mark said as they reviewed the files in his car. Abby's chest tightened. "Then we need to move fast. They'll come after him if they find out he talked." Mark nodded. "I'll send this to my legal team tonight. We'll get another story out as soon as we verify everything." Back at the apartment, Abby paced the small living room, her nerves fraying. Lucy was at the table, poring over the new files, her brow furrowed in concentration. "This is it, Abby," Lucy said finally. "With Eric's testimony and these documents, we've got them." Abby stopped pacing, the weight of Lucy's words settling over her. They were closer than ever to exposing the full extent of Silverline's corruption. But the closer they got, the more dangerous it felt. That night, Abby's fears came to life. She woke to the sound of glass shattering. Her heart leapt into her throat as she sat up, her eyes scanning the dark apartment. Lucy was already moving, grabbing her laptop and shoving it into her bag. "They found us," Lucy whispered. Abby scrambled to her feet, grabbing her backpack and clutching it tightly. "What do we do?" "We run," Lucy said. Footsteps echoed outside the door, heavy and deliberate. Abby's chest tightened as she and Lucy slipped out the back window, landing awkwardly in the alley below. They ran without looking back, their breaths ragged as they darted through the maze of alleys and side streets. The sound of voices shouting behind them spurred them forward, fear driving them faster than they thought possible. They finally stopped in a dimly lit underpass, both of them gasping for air. Abby's hands trembled as she clutched her backpack, her mind racing. "They're not going to stop," Abby said, her voice shaking. "No," Lucy agreed, her tone grim. "But neither are we." The next morning, they contacted Harper. Abby hadn't seen him since the article went live, but she trusted him more than anyone else in law enforcement. He met them at a diner on the outskirts of town, his expression serious as he slid into the booth across from them. "You're in trouble," Harper said bluntly. Lucy nodded. "Silverline found us. They trashed the apartment last night." Harper's jaw tightened. "You need to lay low." They'll keep coming after you until they shut you down or silence you. We can't stop now, Abby said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. We're so close. Harper studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, I'll help, but you have to trust me. Harper arranged a safe house for them, a small cabin outside the city owned by a friend he trusted implicitly. It was quiet and secluded, surrounded by dense woods that made it nearly impossible to approach unseen. For the first time in days, Abby felt a flicker of relief. The cabin was bare, but functional, with enough supplies to last them a few weeks. As they settled in, Harper sat with them at the small kitchen table, his tone serious. If this goes public, it's going to get ugly. Silverline won't just lose money, they'll lose everything. That makes them desperate. Abby swallowed hard. What do we do? You keep fighting, Harper said, but you stay smart, and you let me handle the rest. The following days were a blur of preparation. Lucy worked tirelessly to organize the new files, while Mark coordinated with his team to prepare the next article. Abby helped where she could, but the pressure of their situation weighed heavily on her. One night, as she sat outside the cabin, staring up at the stars, Harper joined her. You're doing something brave, Abby, he said. I'm just scared, she admitted. That's what makes it brave, Harper replied. Courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. Abby nodded, his words sinking in. She thought of her mother, of Lucy, of the people who had helped her along the way. They hadn't given up, and neither would she. By the end of the week, Mark's second article was ready. It detailed Silverline's internal operations, exposing the full extent of their corruption and greed. Eric's testimony was the centerpiece, backed by the overwhelming evidence he had provided. When the article went live, the response was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted across the city, louder and more organized than before. Activists demanded investigations, and politicians scrambled to distance themselves from Silverline. Abby watched the coverage from the cabin, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. The truth was out, and this time, there was no taking it back. The protests filled every corner of the city. Streets once quiet now echoed with the chants of people demanding justice. Signs bearing messages like "No more silver lies" and "Homes over profits" swayed above the crowds. Abby watched the scenes on Mark's laptop in the cabin's small living room, her emotions swinging between hope and anxiety. They're listening, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucy, seated beside her, gave a faint smile. Yeah, they are. But we're not out of this yet. The second article had hit harder than any of them expected. It painted a clear picture of Silverline's corruption, with Eric's testimony and the damning internal documents corroborating everything Abby's mother had uncovered. Media outlets that had ignored the first story were now covering the fallout. But the backlash had intensified as well. Silverline's lawyers doubled down, claiming the evidence was doctored and threatening lawsuits against anyone who spread the story. Their counterattacks felt desperate, but Abby couldn't shake the fear that desperation made them dangerous. One afternoon, Harper arrived with an envelope in hand. His face was grave as he placed it on the kitchen table. What's this? Abby asked, her chest tightening at his expression. It's a subpoena, Harper said. Silverline's suing Mark and his publication for defamation. They're dragging you into it as a witness. Abby's stomach dropped. They can do that. Harper nodded. They're trying to intimidate you. They want to put you on the stand, twist your words, and make you doubt yourself. Lucy frowned, her fingers tapping against the table. We knew they'd fight dirty, but it's a scare tactic. Don't let them shake you, Abby. Abby took a deep breath, her hands curling into fists. I won't, she said, though her voice wavered. Harper placed a hand on her shoulder. You don't have to face them alone. I'll be there. So will Lucy, Mark, and everyone else who believes in you. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. It gave Silverline enough time to build their case, and Abby enough time to wrestle with her nerves. Each day felt heavier than the last. Lucy worked tirelessly to prepare, coaching Abby on how to answer questions and handle the inevitable attacks on her credibility. You just have to tell the truth, Lucy said one evening, her voice steady but kind. Don't let them trip you up. You've got this. Abby nodded, though her stomach churned. The thought of standing in a courtroom, facing Silverline's lawyers, felt like stepping into a storm. The day of the hearing arrived faster than Abby expected. Harper drove her and Lucy to the courthouse early that morning, the city waking around them in a haze of gray. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered with signs of support. Some called out her name, their voices cutting through the tension that had coiled in her chest. "They believe in you," Harper said as they walked toward the steps. "So do I." Abby swallowed hard, her grip tightening on her backpack. The courtroom was colder than she expected, its high ceilings and polished wood making her feel small. Silverline's lawyers sat at a long table, their sharp suits and steely expressions a stark contrast to Abby's simple clothes. Mark sat beside her, his presence a quiet reassurance. The hearing began with opening statements from both sides. Silverline's lead attorney painted Abby and Mark as reckless individuals spreading lies for attention, while Mark's team emphasized the strength of their evidence and the courage it took to expose the truth. Then it was Abby's turn to testify. She took the stand, her heart pounding as she faced the room. The lawyer questioning her was methodical, his tone calm but cutting. "Miss Harris," he began, his voice smooth, "you claim that Silverline Industries engaged in illegal evictions and corruption. But you're just a teenager. What qualifies you to make such accusations?" Abby clenched her fists under the table, willing herself to stay calm. "I don't need qualifications to tell the truth," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. The lawyer raised an eyebrow. "And this so-called evidence you've provided, how can we be sure it's legitimate? Couldn't it have been fabricated by someone seeking to discredit Silverline?" Abby met his gaze, her jaw tightening. "The evidence speaks for itself. It matches what I found in my mother's research, she started before she disappeared." He leaned forward slightly. "Ah, yes, your mother. She was a known activist, wasn't she? Isn't it possible her bias influenced your interpretation of these events?" The words stung, but Abby refused to back down. "My mother fought for what was right," she said firmly. "She saw the truth about Silverline before anyone else did, and they silenced her for it." Her voice wavered slightly, but the room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. As the hearing continued, Mark's lawyers presented the overwhelming evidence against Silverline. Emails, financial records, tenant testimonies, and Eric's detailed account of his time with the company. By the end of the day, the tide seemed to be turning. The judge announced that the case would proceed to trial, ensuring the evidence would be fully examined in court. Outside the courthouse, the protesters erupted in cheers as Abby emerged. Harper and Lucy flanked her, their expressions a mixture of relief and pride. "You were incredible," Lucy said, pulling Abby into a hug. Abby felt tears prick her eyes, but managed a small smile. "We're not done yet." "No," Harper said, his voice steady. "But today you took a big step forward." That night, back at the cabin, Abby allowed herself a rare moment of calm. She sat by the window, staring out at the dark woods, and opened her mother's journal. Every act of courage creates ripples. The words felt truer now than ever. Abby wasn't just fighting for her mother's memory anymore. She was fighting for every person Silverline had hurt, every voice that had been silenced. As she closed the journal, a new thought settled in her mind. The fight wasn't just about exposing Silverline. It was about building something better. The cabin was quiet the morning after the hearing, but the silence felt lighter than it had in days. Abby woke early, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the dense woods outside. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight on her chest ease slightly. She sat at the kitchen table, her mother's journal open before her. The words written so many years ago carried a clarity now, as if her mother had always known Abby would one day need them. Lucy walked in, holding a steaming mug of coffee. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Not much," Abby replied, running her fingers over the journal's worn pages. "But I feel, I don't know, steadier, like we've finally turned a corner." Lucy smiled, pulling out a chair across from her. "We have. Yesterday was a win, Abby. Not just for us, but for everyone Silverline's hurt. The system is paying attention now." Mark arrived later that morning, carrying his laptop and an armful of newspapers. He dropped them on the table with a triumphant grin. Front page, he said, tapping one of the headlines. Teenager speaks out against corruption in Silverline hearing. Abby's face stared back at her from the newsprint. The caption beneath it a mix of disbelief and defiance. You've become the face of this, Mark said, his tone both proud and cautious. That's a lot of pressure, but it also means people are listening. Abby scanned the article, her heart swelling as she read quotes from tenants, activists, and even a few politicians who had called for investigations into Silverline's practices. For the first time, it felt like their voices were louder than the company's denials. The victory was bittersweet. Eric, the whistleblower who had risked everything to share his testimony, called later that afternoon. They're coming after me hard, he said, his voice shaking. My phone's been blowing up with threats, and my name's all over the news. I knew this would happen, but it's a lot. Abby's chest tightened. I'm so sorry, Eric. This isn't fair. It's not about fair, he said after a pause. It's about doing the right thing. And I'd do it again if it means stopping them. Lucy listened to the call from across the room, her brow furrowed. We need to make sure Eric's protected, she said as soon as Abby hung up. We will, Harper replied, stepping in from the porch. I've already got people watching his place. But we also need to focus on the trial. Silverline's going to come at us with everything they've got. In the days that followed, the momentum grew. Advocacy groups organized marches. The media continued to cover the story, and more former tenants and employees came forward with their own accounts. But the backlash also escalated. Abby's name trended on social media, where supporters and detractors clashed in heated debates. Anonymous threats filled her inbox, and Mark received a warning from Silverline's lawyers about consequences for continuing to publish stories. This is what they do, Harper reminded them during one tense meeting. They intimidate, they lie, they spin the narrative. But it's not working this time. People are seeing through it. The turning point came unexpectedly. One afternoon, Lucy received a call from a woman claiming to have crucial information. She introduced herself as Maria Delgado, a former Silverline executive who had worked closely with the company's leadership. I've seen everything, Maria said. The payoffs, the cover-ups, the plans to push people out of their homes. I kept records, and I'm ready to share them. Why now? Lucy asked cautiously. Maria's voice wavered. Because I can't keep living with this. And because I've been watching Abby. She reminds me of what it means to be brave. They met Maria in a small cafe just outside the city. She was a composed woman in her 50s, her demeanor betraying only hints of the fear and guilt she carried. She handed Lucy a flash drive, her hands trembling slightly. This is everything, Maria said. Emails, contracts, recordings. They won't be able to deny it anymore. Mark scanned the files on his laptop, his eyes widening as he clicked through them. This is the smoking gun, he said, his voice hushed. Maria nodded, her expression somber. But you need to move quickly. Once they realize I've given this to you, they'll come after me too. That night, back at the cabin, the weight of Maria's decision sank in. She didn't have to do this, Abby said quietly. No, Lucy Blade. But she did because she believes in what we're doing. And because you gave her the courage to stand up. Abby thought of all the people who had helped her along the way: Lucy, Harper, Mark, Mrs. Carter, Eric, and now Maria. Each act of kindness and courage had brought them closer to the truth. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Every act of courage creates ripples. Mark published the final article the next morning. It was explosive, detailing Silverline's corruption with undeniable evidence. Maria's testimony added a human element, her words a stark reminder of the greed and callousness that had driven the company's actions. Within hours, calls for a federal investigation flooded the airwaves. Politicians who had once aligned with Silverline distanced themselves, and the company's stock plummeted as investors pulled out. But it was the people who had suffered the most: the tenants, the evicted families, the overlooked employees who made their voices heard. By the end of the week, the Department of Justice announced a formal investigation into Silverline Industries. Warrants were issued, and several executives were arrested. Abby watched the news from the cabin, tears streaming down her face. For the first time, it felt like justice was within reach. A month later, Abby stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by Lucy, Harper, and Mark. Reporters crowded around her, their cameras flashing as she prepared to speak. "Today isn't just about Silverline," Abby said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "It's about standing up to systems that hurt people. It's about remembering that even the smallest acts of courage can change the world." The crowd erupted into applause, and Abby felt a swell of hope. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning she never could have imagined months ago. That night, back at the cabin, Abby sat by the window, her mother's journal in her lap. She opened it to the final page where her mother had written, "You are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and more important than you realize." Abby smiled, closing the journal and looking out at the night sky. She was no longer the invisible girl hiding in a laundromat. She was part of something bigger, now something that could make a difference. And for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. If this story of courage, resilience, and the fight for justice has inspired you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share powerful stories like Abby's stories that shine a light on critical issues, celebrate acts of kindness, and inspire change. Join our growing community of changemakers by hitting the subscribe button. Together, we can amplify voices that need to be heard and create ripples of hope and transformation. Thank you for being part of this journey.